The most important single central fact about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. Milton Friedman, American economist and statistician. All right. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early and when it's so cold. I mean, I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, and it's in the 30s here. So if you're listening from up north, trust me, I feel you because I used to live up there. There's a reason that I moved down south, and that was a large part of it. So I feel you, and even still, even though I lived up there, coming down here doesn't, like people say, "Well, you used to live there," and I'm like, "Yes, used to." That's the operative word here. It's a reason why I don't live up north anymore. But it's a chilly morning for sure. Probably bitter cold for some others. And we're going to be all in solidarity with each other. But again, thank you for joining me. Today, I want to do something a little out of the ordinary, something that I don't normally do. And that I'm going to play an entire speech. It's 23 minutes. You probably heard about Javier Milei's speech that he gave at the World Economic Forum. Now, if you're not familiar with the World Economic Forum, please flip over the rock that you're living under and come out and join the rest of us and at least be familiar. The World Economic Forum, just to put it as neutral as possible, is an organization full of world leaders that seeks to change the world. That's about as neutral as you can get. Now, there's all kind of conspiracy theories about what they want to do and this and that, and some of them seem to have some legitimate teeth, right? You look and you can see, like, hey, this is the conspiracy theory. This is what they are saying, right? Of course, they're not saying it in the same way that the conspiracy theorists say it as well, but a lot of times when you are looking at governments from the libertarian perspective, and in my opinion, it really should be from anyone's perspective. When you are looking at government and they come up with an idea that's going to make things in general just better, the best thing that you can do is to put on your conspiracy theory hat. And it's not because necessarily everybody is so devilish, although that sometimes too. It's because at the end of the day, their plans just don't work out. And so then what you have to identify is, what is the consequence? Like, what what is the reality when these plans don't work out? Right? Because we think of a plan, we're like, man, it's gonna go like this and this and this and this. Think of it this way, right? Let's say I'm a single man and I go out to the bar, I'm having a drink, and there's some nice music playing, and I see an attractive woman sitting over there on the other side of the bar. And I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go talk to her. And so in my mind, I play it out exactly how it's gonna work, right? I'm like, I'm gonna say this, and then she might say this, and whatever. And I've got it all kind of worked out in my mind. And then I go over and it never plays out that way, right? Now, unlike the bar where you have a potential chance that things go well, right? Like there's an opportunity there, um, because it could go into a different direction and still be a positive outcome, or it can go in a different direction and be a very negative outcome, right? Like she laughs at you, she makes fun of you, something, something kind of like insulting or whatever. And so, with the case of government, when things go wrong, there's a strong history of things going wildly wrong for people. And a lot of times it just gets covered up. This is why we have programs in place for so long, why they're constantly like, well, we got to add more money. Like, and when we change leadership, then it's like, the person that implemented is never the person that has to deal with the consequences. So there's all these reasons why things just tend to go very, very wrong. Now, they don't have to always go very wrong and like throwing people in. in dungeons and stuff like that. Like, it doesn't have to be that. It could just be that very wrong ends up being not very good for somebody who goes under the radar. Like, and so for that person, things turned out terribly for them, and they may not even realize the source of the problem. So, all that being said, I want to walk through an article first before we get into his speech, because I kind of want to lay a little bit of a foundation for his speech. So let me pull this article up on the screen here. And the article is dated October 4th, 2023. And I'm gonna read a good portion of it, maybe not all of it, because it's a sizable article here. But it says Argentina was one of the world's richest countries. Now, hopefully you know that, and there's going to be an interesting phrase that we're going to come across here in a little bit. Now, poverty is rife and inflation is over 100%. Okay, so like, what happened? How did you go from being one of the world's richest countries to being in poverty and inflation over 100%? So it goes down and it says, and I'm probably going to mispronounce some of these names. Calle, Florida is a long shopping strip in downtown Buenos Aires, lined with opulent 20th century buildings, echoes of the Argentinian capital's Gilded Age. So that, like, we're already starting off saying like, hey, look, they've got buildings that are, these 20th century opulent buildings, and take a look at some of these. Like, these are really, really nice looking buildings, especially at the time. They probably were really nice. Like, now they kind of, maybe don't look as exciting. But look at, like, you can see that the structures are crafted in a way so that they have some character to them, right? And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, like, they actually have some meaningful character to them, even as they look a little bit on the old side. All right. But today it's the sound of black market money exchangers shouting, cambio, cambio, exchange, exchange, echoing off the stone facades. Here, desperate locals swap out ever growing wads of pesos for US dollars, even though the so called blue dollar exchange is done at just half the official rate. It's dodgy. It's a dodgy deal many are willing to make in a country where annual inflation is running at more than 100%, and the pesos in your hand are worth less all the time. So, like, their own money, like, they could wake up and the money that they had the day before is now worth less than it was the day before. Buenos Aires, once dubbed the Paris of South America for its European architecture and cosmopolitan culture, was for a long time the capital of a rich and prosperous nation. Think about that. We can say all the time, like, oh, they used to be a rich country. And we could say, look at all this data, and we could pull out charts and all that. Think of it more simple than that. Buenos Aires was once called Paris of South America. I mean, I think that's pretty. I think that says something. I mean, and you see these kind of things all over in the US, Tulsa, Oklahoma, back in the 1900s. There used to be an area, I'm trying to, the green, I think it's the Greenwood district, used to be the Black Wall Street because it was so prosperous, right? Like, we've seen prosperity, and when we see it, we know it, and then we give it nicknames. The Black Wall Street, Paris of South America. Let's continue. All right. Today, about 40% of Argentinians are living in poverty, and the economy is barreling towards recession. A long running economic crisis, exacerbated by a global spike in inflation since the end of the pandemic, has sent Argentina's cost of living skyrocketing to 30-year highs. So, the pandemic, which many of us said, hey, this is going to have a negative impact. Look who it had a really negative impact on: a country that was already suffering. The things that we did made poor people worse off. And this is, I think, the core of what Javier is going to talk about in just a minute. All right. And now the country's economic turmoil is fueling the rise of a far right political insurgency ahead of a general election later this month, as Argentinians look for more radical solutions. So here's the thing, people. If you don't want crazy radical solutions, then maybe don't implement what I would call crazy radical solutions. And that's what people did. Just like those in Cali, Florida, desperately looking to shore up their personal finances, one solution on the table could see the entire nation embrace the U.S. currency, a proposal that has been criticized by more than 100 economists who warn it could spell an economic catastrophe. Now, I'm not going to get into the details. I'm not an economist, so there's really no point in me, and I'm not really making an argument here or there for whether or not they should adopt the dollar, right? Like they should embrace U.S. currency. Uh, Look, that's beyond my level of skill set to talk about in any meaningful way. Country is getting worse. While Australians are contending with annual price rises of about 5%, in Argentina, prices are doubling each year on average. You know how averages work, right? Like averages could be all over the place. That's on average. So there are some things that are probably more than doubling some prices. The sticker shock has been astounding at times. In August, the price of ice cream reportedly shot up 100% in a month. Ice cream. The price of alcohol and tobacco has also more than doubled in the past year. While eye-watering inflation is bad news for consumers, business owners such as Oscar Rodriguez, who runs a small bar called Bar Portuario in the working-class suburb of La Boca in central Buenos Aires, are also struggling to keep pace. He used to change the prices on his chalkboard menu once a month. Now it's once a week, maybe twice a week, he tells Foreign Correspondent. Other restaurants are recalculating the prices even more frequently, he says, sometimes up to twice a day or more. This is the situation that they were in. They were in a situation where restaurants might literally say, okay, we're changing the price. Like this would be like if you took some of the worst gas prices and that we've seen in the US where they were changing and you just compress them all into like a week, that's what they were seeing. Where like, you know, you go to the gas station, imagine going to the gas station and they literally are changing the price as you're pulling in, right? And then maybe change it again before you pull out. Like, that's crazy. The rising cost of raw ingredients means Oscar needs to pass on costs to his customers. Now, hopefully, my audience doesn't need to know how all of that works, but just in case there's somebody that's a little unfamiliar, prices are what it's going to cost them to get the next round in, right? So that's they're paying for what you are paying for them to be able to purchase more. Right? That's what it is because they gotta be able to afford the next, I wanna say ingredients here. I'm trying to be a little bit more broad. If I run a business, I need to be able to pay for the the next product, delivery, and so this is why your prices are gonna rise so quickly. So, and Argentina might be world famous for its steak, but it's increasingly becoming a luxury item after a 70% rise price rise over the past year. A sign at Oscar's local butcher reads, "We'll exchange 2 kilograms of meat for an apartment in Palermo." Okay, so like this is just not a good situation that they were in. Okay. And again, if people don't want radical solutions, then maybe don't accept radical solutions. The country is getting worse, says Juan Garcia Longi, who has been running and I'm not gonna be able to say, but a soup kitchen a few blocks away in La Boca for 15 years. He once provided free meals for about 40 people, but today the number has ballooned to more than 500. 500 people. Like it once used to be that 40 people needed a free meal, but now 500? Like this is not good. It's not just inflation fueling Argentina's economic crisis. The country is heavily indebted, including owing US 44 billion to the International Monetary Fund and has been pushed to the brink of recession by a severe drought that has cost the economy an estimated 20 billion in lost revenue. So hopefully here, without getting into all the crazy details, it's very clear that hey, their economic situation was terrible. Where it all started. So this is about where we're going to start cutting off here in just a minute and we'll jump into his speech. It wasn't always so dire in Argentina. At the beginning of the 20th century, the country's name was synonymous with wealth, and the expression rich as an Argentine was bandied around. Now, I hope that you've heard that, like, and when we started seeing the rise of Javier Milei, I think I'd heard of this before, but I really never paid much attention to it. And then with the rise of Javier Milei, I recalled that and I started seeing references to it again. But once upon a time, that was a phrase that you would hear around the world. Oh, you're rich as an, like, people would say, "Oh, you're doing very well. You're like an Argentine." Like they were known for prosperity. Like, think about what I just read. We went from like 40 people needing a free meal a day to like 500. And there was a time when the idea of being Argentine was associated with being wealthy, blessed with extraordinary natural resources, including minerals and vast swaths of productive land. Argentina was one of the richest nations on per capita basis in the world. The argument about where it all went wrong is politically fraught, but the economic data suggests the country's persistent troubles with inflation started in the mid 1940s with the rise of Juan Domingo Perón to power. As President Perón drew economic inspiration from Mussolini's fascist Italy and started remaking the economy. Huh. Interesting, right? All right. So his program of nationalizing production, erecting trade barriers, empowering unions, and boosting wages. Sound familiar? While increasing welfare payments made him and his wife, Eva, heroes among the working class. Does that sound at all familiar? Nationalizing production. We haven't really nationalized production, but we've had a lot of people talk about, hey, you know what would be great? We need to nationalize this. We need to put the power to the people, blah, blah, blah. Right? Erecting trade barriers, empowering unions. Now, I don't tend to have an issue with unions as a concept, but the way that they actually operate has been terrible, especially when they get government assistance in enforcing their, their limitations, and then boosting wages while increasing welfare payments. So, like, these are all things that were not good. But his policies were largely paid for by printing money, which led to runaway inflation. Heard about that recently? The Fed printing money? Whenever a Federal Reserve prints money, just know inflation is to follow. That's how it works. All right, let's see. Let's skip the rest of this. I just wanted to lay the foundation. Now let's get into Javier's speech. I'm going to play it and then I'll chime in if I have an additional thought. So let's bring that up on the screen here. And here we are.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Let me just pause real quick. I want to say one thing, and I know he hasn't said anything just yet. This is amazing because you just heard he doesn't speak English. This has somebody used AI, I think it was Hey Gen, and they dubbed this using the sound of his own voice into English. So this is what it would sound like if he spoke English. So that's amazing. That's just an amazing thing that somebody did.
Today, I am present to inform you that the Western world is facing a significant threat. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the Western world are co-opted by a worldview that inevitably leads to socialism and consequently to poverty and economic deprivation. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some well-intentioned desires to help others and others by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. We are here to tell you that collectivist experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world, but rather they are their cause. Trust me, There is no one better than us Argentines to provide testimony on these two issues. When we embraced freedom in 1860, in 35 years, we became the world's first dominant power. 35 years, we became the first world power. While when we embraced collectivism, over the past 100 years, we saw how our citizens began to systematically impoverish themselves until they fell to the 140th position in the world. 40 in the world. But before we can have this discussion, it would be important for us to first look at the data that supports why free market capitalism is not only a possible system to end world poverty, but also the only morally desirable system to achieve it. If we consider the history of economic progress, we can see how from year zero until around 1800, the world's per capita GDP remained practically constant throughout the reference period. If one looks at a chart of the evolution of economic growth throughout human history, one would be seeing a chart with the shape of a hockey stick, an exponential function that remained constant for 90% of the time and exponentially shoots up from the 19th century. The sole exception to this stagnant history was at the end of the 15th century with America's discovery. Except for this, from year zero to 1800, global per capita GDP remained stagnant without any significant changes. Now, not only did capitalism generate an explosion of wealth from the moment it was adopted as an economic system, but if one analyzes the data, what is observed is that growth has been accelerating throughout the entire period. During the entire period between year zero and 1800, the per capita GDP growth rate remained stable at around 0.02% annually, that is, practically without growth. From 19th century, with Industrial Revolution, growth rate reaches 0.66%. Given the current rate, it would require a time span of approximately 107 years to achieve a twofold increase in per capita GDP. In 1900-1950, growth rate rises to 1.66% annually. 150 growth rate rises to 1.36% annually. We no longer need 107 years to double per capita GDP, but 66. If we take the period between 1950 and the year 2000, we can see that the growth rate was 2.1% annually, which would mean that in just 33 years, we could double the world's per capita GDP.
In 33 years, we could double the world's capita for GDP. 33 years. That is literally like I could still be alive, hopefully, in 33 years to see this. Like that's how short of a time frame it is. We're talking about 33 years. I'm 45. Add 33 years to that. That puts me at 78. I could still technically be alive to see that kind of a change. I think that's amazing. And I appreciate the fact that he's coming with actual data and he's comparing the world before we saw capitalism really rise, right? And there's further detail that you can get. I would recommend that you, if you really want to dig into the data, I would recommend you look up economists like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. They have a lot of articles and some books that actually go through this and talk about it. Now, I want to go back from, just briefly, and he's talking about, he said well-intentioned. And I think that's very important that we keep in our mind that a lot of these ideas come from people who think that they are doing good. But I'm going to read you a quote here from Thomas Sowell. And he says, if there's any lesson in the history of ideas, it is that good intentions tell you nothing about the actual consequences. But intellectuals who generate ideas don't have to pay the consequences. So a lot of the people that come up with these great ideas about, oh, we're going to do this new thing in the name of progress, it's going to be great. If it fails, and they often do, the people that came up with those ideas never have to pay a consequence for them. In fact, usually what ends up happening is they get heralded by people and then they make excuses for why their idea didn't work. It wasn't implemented correctly. Not everybody was on board. We didn't put enough money into it. Yeah, I mean, schools are an example of that. People keep saying, "Oh, we just got to put more money. We need more money. We need more money." Well, at some point, maybe we address the reality, which is the idea was not good in the first place. All right, let's get back to his speech.
This trend, far from stopping, remains alive even now. If we consider the period from 2000 to 2023, the growth rate increased again at 3% per year, meaning we could double our per capita GDP globally in only 23 years. Now, when studying per capita GDP from 1800 to today, what is observed is that after the Industrial Revolution, global per capita GDP multiplied by more than 15 times, generating an explosion of wealth that lifted 90% of the world's population out of poverty.
90% came out of poverty. Now, a lot of people might say, well, yeah, what about that 10%? Okay. You will always have poor people. Jesus once said it. He said, the poor will always be with you for one reason or another. Not everybody's going to do the things that they need to do. No system is ever perfect, but 90% were lifted out of poverty. It's pretty amazing.
We must never forget that by the year 1800, about 95% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, while that number dropped to 5% by the year 2020, prior to the pandemic. The conclusion is obvious. Far from being the cause of our problems, free market capitalism as an economic system is the only tool we have to end hunger, poverty, and destitution throughout the planet. The empirical evidence is unquestionable. Therefore, as there is no doubt that free market capitalism is superior in productive terms, the left's doxa has attacked capitalism for its moral issues, for being, according to them, as its detractors say, unjust.
So let's talk about that. First and foremost, I think one thing that is really important. Now, I don't know how Javier would define free market and capitalism, but I'm going to be willing to wager that he would accept my definitions. So here are my definitions. Very simple. Capitalism. That just means private people have ownership, right? Like I can have a business of any kind that I want. I'm just a regular person. I'm not a government person. Not any kind of collective. Just any individual person can own. This is private ownership of the means of production. So a regular citizen could simply have a stamping plant, right? That kind of a thing. Free market, no regulations. The freer the market, the fewer the regulations, the freer the market. And when you have that, you see growth. And then what he's talking about, like people saying like, well, they're attacking, because it's not just. When they say it's not just, what they're saying is it's not giving me the results I think should be expected. And this is an issue of expectations. Like, oh, well, and a lot of it is just finding finding someone that didn't make it, right? Like you can always find the exception. Like you said, there were still 5%. I don't think that free market capitalism will ever make it 0%. I don't think any economic system will ever make it zero. There will always be somebody that's poor. There will always be somebody that doesn't have, and there will always be people that have a whole lot more than somebody else. The question is, which economic system allows for the broadest, how do we want to say it? The broadest implementation of that, of people being able to have access to wealth and being removing themselves from poverty. And I would say that free market capitalism, by all the data, like he's talking about, all the evidence shows this is the system. We want to help people. That is the system that we want. All right, let's continue on.
They claim capitalism is bad because it's individualistic and collectivism is good because it's altruistic towards others. And thus they strive for social justice. But this concept that has become trendy in the developed world Recently, in my country, it has been a constant in political discourse for over 80 years. The issue is
All right, so let's pause that for real quick. 80 years is long enough, right? Like a lot of people say, well, they'll try to make excuses. No, 80 years. You had 80 years to work it out, right? At least to have he said the political discourse. You had 80 years to talk about it, argue about it, and whenever it came time to implement it, like you had time. Like there was no shortage of time. We're not talking about like, hey, okay, we had an idea and we just got to work out some of the kinks. No, you had plenty of time and it failed. It failed miserably.
that social justice is unfair and doesn't contribute to general well being. On the contrary, it's an inherently unfair idea because it's violent. It's unfair because the state is financed through taxes, and taxes are collected coercively. Or can any of us confidently say that they pay taxes of their own free will?
Nope.
This implies that the state is funded through coercion and that the higher the tax burden, the greater the coercion, leading to a reduction in freedom. Those who promote social justice start from the idea that the economy as a whole is a cake that can be distributed in a different way. But that cake is not given. It is wealth that is generated in what, for example, Israel Kirchner calls a market discovery process. If the good or service that a company offers is not desired, that company goes bankrupt unless it adapts to what the market is demanding. Create a high-quality product at a good price or attractive, succeed and produce more, so the market is a process of discovery where the capitalist finds the right direction on the go.
So there used to be a phrase, you may have heard of it, and it said something along the line of, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. And that's basically what he's getting at here. It's like, look, you do something that people want, they are going to seek it out. You provide something that they want, you build that better mousetrap. I mean, mousetraps haven't changed largely over time. It's still the same, like little rectangle piece of wood with metal on it that, with the spring, and it flips over and it catches the mouse. Like they largely haven't changed. I mean, we've had some different designs, but that's like, if you go to the store, that's the same design. But if I were to design a better one for whatever reason, like however it might be better, the world will basically beat a path to my door. They will seek it out to purchase it.
But if the state punishes the capitalist for success and blocks him in this process, it destroys his incentives. And the consequences are that he will produce less and the cake will be smaller, generating harm to society.
He's absolutely correct here. What is the harm to society? Now let's just think about it. Let's just kind of go with this mousetrap analogy here. Imagine that, like, I come up with a great mousetrap, and the mousetrap does, it catches your mouse. It's safe for all your pets. It, maybe it doesn't even harm the mouse, whatever, I mean, I know there's technically traps like that. But imagine that I come up with this new mousetrap and people really want it because they have maybe they don't like some of the elements of the mousetrap. And so if I'm punished for being successful, for coming up with that idea, then everybody loses because I'm not going to be incentivized to come up with another idea. And if people really liked my first idea, maybe they'll really like my second idea. And if they feel better off because of my first idea, the new mousetrap, when I come up with some other idea, if I'm not regulated to hell, then what ends up happening, if I'm not regulated, then people's lives are better off, not in one ways, but in two ways. They're better off from my first idea, the better mousetrap, and then the second idea, whatever that idea might be. But if I get punished, then I'm going to think twice. And I'm going to say, well, is it really worth it? Is it really worth for me putting all this incentive into it in order to just be punished by the government, which is basically what it is? They may not be saying it in punishment language, but that's exactly what's happening. If I have to pay a huge amount of taxes because a lot of people wanted my product, and maybe the paying of that taxes ends up leaving me worse off, or at least leaving me in a situation where I need to reconsider whether or not that was even a good idea. And so if I start reconsidering my ideas, and let's just say that I'm good at coming up with these ideas, the world is less is worse off because they are not getting access to those ideas from me. That's what he's getting at.
Collectivism, by inhibiting discovery and hindering appropriation, ties the entrepreneur's hands, preventing him from producing better goods and offering better services at a better price. How can it be then that from academia, international orgs, politics, and econ theory, an econ system is demonized that not only has lifted 90% of the world's pop out of extreme poverty and does so increasingly faster, but is also fair and morally superior? Thanks to capitalism, the world is currently in its best moment. There has never been a moment in history with greater prosperity than the one we live in today. Today's world is freer, richer, more peaceful, and more prosperous than ever before. This is true for everyone, but particularly for those countries that are free, where they respect economic freedom and individual property rights. Because free countries are 12 times richer than repressed ones. Saying goes that in countries with freedom, people live better than 90% of population in repressed countries. It has 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format and 50 times fewer in the extreme format. And if that weren't enough, citizens of free countries live 25% longer than citizens of repressed countries. Now, in order to understand what we come to defend, it is important to define what we mean when we talk about libertarianism.
Okay. I just can't help this. He's at the World Economic Forum and he says libertarianism. How cool is that? It's pretty exciting. I don't know how many people I've met and I'm like, yeah, I'm a libertarian. And they're like, a what? I'm like, yeah, I'm a libertarian. This is the kind of things I believe in. And they're like, oh, like they've never even heard the word. I've met people that have never even heard the word. And here he is getting up on the World Economic Forum, talking about libertarianism is in a positive light. And you might remember, what's that bald headed dude's name? I just can't think of his name. Klaus Schwab. He, at one point, it was like, what, a month ago, something like that. Maybe it was a little bit longer ago. But he came out and he had negative things to say about libertarianism. And then here you got a guy coming up and saying, actually, here's the reality. I think this is fabulous. All right, let's continue on listening.
To define it, I take up the words of the greatest proponent of the ideas of freedom in Argentina, Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch, who says that libertarianism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of others, based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose fundamental institutions are private property, free markets without state intervention, free competition, division of labor, and social cooperation, where one can only be successful by serving others with goods of better quality at a better price. In other words, the capitalist, the successful entrepreneur, is a social benefactor who contributes to the well-being of society as a whole. In short, a successful entrepreneur is a hero. This is the model that we are proposing for the future of Argentina, a model based on the fundamental principles of libertarianism, the defense of life, freedom, and property. Now, if free market capitalism and economic freedom have been remarkable instruments to eradicate poverty globally, and we are presently experiencing the most favorable period in human history, it is worth inquiring why I assert that the West is in jeopardy. I argue that the West is endangered as in countries defending free market, private property, and other institutions of libertarianism, sectors of the political and economic establishment, due to errors in their theoretical framework and ambition for power, undermine libertarianism, opening doors to socialism and potentially condemning us to poverty, misery, and stagnation. Because it should never be observed that socialism is always and everywhere impoverishing, failed in all countries where attempted. It was a failure economically, it was a failure socially, it was a failure culturally, and it also killed more than 100 million human beings. The main problem of the West today is that we not only have to confront those who, even after the fall of the wall and overwhelming evidence, continue to advocate for impoverishing socialism, but also our own leaders, thinkers, and academics who, sheltered in a misguided framework, undermine the foundations of the system that has given us the greatest wealth and prosperity in our history.
So you might remember a few moments ago, I read you that quote from Thomas Sowell, where he said that a lot of these people that have come up with these ideas, they pay no cost when those ideas go wrong. Now, if I'm an entrepreneur, going back to my mousetrap, if I'm an entrepreneur and I create a better mousetrap or any product that people really, really want, and they beat that path to my door, they get here, they're basically, it's the meme of the internet. Here, take my money, right? Like that's what they're doing. The reason they're doing that is because they feel better off by having my product than they would by keeping their money. That is why they make that exchange, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's a barter system. If they come and they say, hey, for your mousetrap, I'd like to give you this gallon of milk. Will you take a gallon of milk? Then that means that they would prefer to have my mousetrap than they would that gallon of milk. This is why, yes, entrepreneurs are heroes. However, if as an entrepreneur, I give crappy ideas, like things fall apart, they don't work as advertised, then I will be punished for it. Not in a negative sense, like not in a mean way, like necessarily, but the market will punish me because as quickly as that path was beaten to my door, it can be overgrown when people stop walking to it. His word will get out like, hey, his products suck, whatever. His customer service is terrible, whatever the case is, right? And but unlike me, people that have these ideas about socialism, and they sit around and they get to talk about these ideas and theorize about them with the little consequence for when the ideas go wrong. He said 100 million people were killed. Tell me which intellectual paid the price for those ideas. Name the intellectual that got strung up or whatever for the 100 million deaths that were caused by his or her bad idea. None. They paid no consequence for it. In fact, if you look, many of them are revered today. So it's the opposite.
The theoretical framework I am referring to is neoclassical economic theory, which designs an instrument unintentionally functional to the intrusion of the state, socialism, and the degradation of society. The issue with neoclassicals is that since the model they fell in love with doesn't match reality, they attribute the error to the supposed market failure instead of revising the premises of their model. On the text about a supposed market failure, regulations are introduced that only generate distortions in the price system that hinder economic calculation and consequently savings, investment, and growth. This problem essentially lies in the fact that not even supposedly libertarian economists understand what the market is, since if it were understood, it would quickly be seen that it is impossible for there to be such a thing as a market failure. The market is not just a graphical description of a supply curve and a demand curve on a graph. The market is a mechanism of social cooperation where property rights are voluntarily exchanged.
Okay, so when he's talking about what he just said there, that is I came up with a great product. People beat a path to my door voluntarily. You didn't have to force them. I come up with a great idea. People are going to find their way to get to my door and say, take my money. That's how it works. It's very voluntary. You don't need to coerce anybody into it. And we're going to address this whole free market failures in a second.
Thus, considering this definition, discussing market failure is a contradiction in terms. There is no market failure. If transactions are voluntary, the only situation in which there can be a market failure is if there is coercion present. And the only one with the ability to coerce in a generalized manner is the state that possesses the monopoly of violence. Consequently, if someone considers that there is a market failure, I would recommend that they check if there is state intervention in the middle. If no state intervention found, suggest reanalyzing as it is definitely wrong.
All right. So market failure. There is no such thing as a market failure unless there is a government to interfere into the market. So if you're trying to beat a path to my door to get my product, and then the government says, whoa, 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 hold up. DL can only sell one of those per customer. Well, all of a sudden now they've introduced an interference in that voluntary exchange between you and I, because you might be coming and saying, hey, I'd like to have two, but the government might says, no, 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 you can only buy one. So if something happens where that one was insufficient for you for whatever reason, then that is considered a market failure. And that's what he's talking about. The market failure is a result of the government. And this is why, because the market, the people that think in terms of market failure, they only think in terms of success. And the reality is that that the market is built on like, let's call it wins and losses, right? And the losses self-correct to bring about more wins. If I spend let's say I invest $10,000 into coming up with a product, and I come up with that product and I go out to sell it, and nobody wants to buy it. Guess what? The market has told me that I delivered something that it wasn't looking for. We don't need the government to get involved. That is my loss. That helps correct me for the next time that I want to spend $10,000 and come up with a new product. I say, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. The last time I spent $10,000, I ended up losing all of it. So maybe this time I'll do some market research. Maybe this time I'll create a small handful of prototypes, and then I will give them out to people for free. And instead of costing $10,000, maybe it costs me $1,000. And then I can kind of gauge whether or not this is something that the market desires, right? So the market self corrects based on wins and losses. But what happens, a lot of regulation tries to cover up for those losses. And so then people blame things and say, well, it's the market's fault. No, it is the person who is interfering in the market. This is what he's getting at. Let's continue.
Market failures do not exist. An example of the alleged market failures described by neoclassicals are concentrated structures in the economy. However, without functions that demonstrate increasing returns to scale, whose counterpart are the concentrated structures of the economy, we would be unable to explain the phenomenon of economic growth from 1800 to the present day. Look how interesting. Commencing from the year 1800 and extending onwards, with the population experiencing a multiplication of more than 8 or 9 times, the per capita income underwent a growth of more than 15 times in magnitude. To clarify, there are more returns. This caused poverty to drop from 95% to 5%. However, the presence of increasing yields implies the existence of concentrated structures, which would be referred to as, for example, a monopoly in the market economy. How can it be that something that has generated so much well-being, according to neoclassical theory, that is considered a market failure? Neoclassical economists think outside the box. When the model fails, don't get angry with reality. Get angry with the model and change it.
And that actually applies to everything. And this is what I'm saying, like when I point out that people who get to theorize about ideas and then push them off onto, like, say, governments to implement, they pay no cost for it. They don't have to they can just be like, no, the idea was good. I don't have to rethink it. It was a you problem, not a me problem. But this applies to everything. It applies to entrepreneurs and applies to even governments as well. If I, as an entrepreneur, again, want to spend $10,000 for a product, and the product doesn't sell, it's not the free market's fault. It's my fault. I made an error somewhere along the line. I need to go back to the drawing board and I need to identify what it was about my idea that failed. Same thing applies when we're talking about social ideas. When the social idea doesn't work, and quite often they don't, then it's not the problem of the free market. It's not the problem of the people. It is the problem of the idea itself. And that idea needs to be revisited. And as he's pointed out this whole time, we can see rapid growth. So if you have an idea about to just implement socially, there is no, it might take 100 years, 50 years. No, we've seen rapid growth. We have seen rapid advancement, rapid improvement in the lives of people. So if your idea can't get there in 10 years, 5 years, a shorter amount of time than, like, what was it, 33 that he said earlier, then it's probably not a superior idea. And by probably I mean it's almost definitely not.
Dilemma for the neoclassical model is that they aim to enhance market functioning by targeting perceived failures. By doing so, they not only open doors to socialism, but also undermine economic growth. For instance, implementing regulations on monopolies, dismantling their profits, and obliterating increasing returns would inevitably annihilate economic growth. In other words, each time you want to correct a presumed market failure, inevitably, due to not knowing the market or because you have become attached to a failed model, you are opening doors to socialism and condemning people to poverty. However, in the face of the theoretical demonstration that state intervention is harmful, the empirical evidence that it failed because it could not be otherwise, the solution that collectivists will propose is not greater freedom, but greater regulation, generating a downward spiral of regulations until we all become poorer and the lives of all of us depend on a bureaucrat sitting in a luxury office. Given the resounding failure of collectivist models and the undeniable advances of the free world, socialists were forced to change their agenda. They left behind the class struggle based on the economic system to replace it with other supposed social conflicts equally harmful to community life and economic growth. The first of these new battles was the ridiculous and unnatural fight between man and woman. Libertarianism already establishes equality between sexes. The cornerstone of our creed states that all men are created equal, that we all have the same unalienable rights granted by the Creator, among which are life, liberty, and property. This radical feminism agenda has led to increased state intervention, hindering the economic process. It provides jobs to bureaucrats who haven't contributed anything to society, whether through women's ministries or international organizations promoting this agenda. Another conflict that socialists pose is that of humans against nature. They argue that humans cause harm to the planet and that it must be protected at all costs, even advocating for population control mechanisms or supporting the controversial agenda of abortion rights. Unfortunately, these harmful ideas have strongly permeated our society. Neo-Marxists have managed to co-opt the common sense of the Western world.
So let's I don't want to get into him too deeply. I think he's said enough there, but I want to point out one thing, because he talked about this conflict between men, men and women, male and female, and then also this idea that, hey, it's us against the world, kind of like we're we and I think of it this way: is society better off with these ideas just socially? Think about all the stories you've heard about marriages splitting up, people fighting each other, people hating each other, people getting fired, cancel culture, all the is society, skip the economic conversation for a moment. Just is society, does it feel better with all of these arguments? And these were introduced, just like he said, like they introduced them. They've said, like, hey, We need to deal with this. We need this feminism in this particular way, um, to to level out things, right? We need to do this. We need to do that. And you can include other things like DEI and all these other. Like there are plenty of social ideas that have been put out there, implemented in some way. And ask yourself, are we more cohesive as a society or less? And I would argue we're much less.
They achieved this through the appropriation of the media, culture, universities, and yes, even international organizations. The final case is very serious, as it involves institutions with huge influence on the political and economic decisions of the countries in these multilateral organizations. Fortunately, more of us dare to raise our voices as we see that if we don't confront these ideas head on, the only possible destiny is more state, more regulation, more socialism, more poverty, less freedom, and consequently, a worse quality of life.
So he's basically summarized all of those dystopian books that we grew up reading. He just summarized all that, right? Like, I mean, you should still go read them if you haven't, but he basically summarized this is what happens. It is a downward spiral because one regulation begets another regulation. Oh, and think about what he said. He said that, all these ideas are ideas that don't work, that haven't worked, and we have to continually add more regulation. But when we add more regulation, we reduce freedom. And think about it. People don't say we have never gotten to a point where someone says, you know what? Turns out that regulation is no longer needed. Our social implementation, our social plan that we implemented totally worked. We can remove some regulations because we don't even need them anymore. No, instead, and it's not even a neutral, like, hey, we don't need any more, but we're good with the ones we got. It's not that either. It's always, we need more regulation. Well, we got to have this. Well, we got to have this. Why do we have to keep having regulation? Because the ideas don't work in the first place. And so we have to keep compensating for the failures of the ideas. And that's what he's talking about. Like we have to go back and say, maybe the idea was junk in the first place.
Unfortunately, the West has already started down this path. To many, it may sound ridiculous to suggest that the West has embraced socialism, but this view is only ridiculous if one limits themselves to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which states that it is an economic system where the state owns the means of production. In my opinion, this definition needs to be updated to reflect the current circumstances from my perspective. Today, states don't need to control means of production to control every aspect of individuals' lives. With tools such as monetary issuance, debt, subsidies, interest rate control, price controls, and regulations to correct alleged market failures, they can control the destinies of millions of human beings.
So let me just throw something out there on this. He says, the old definition is, not necessary because we have new institutions that were either not in place or we're not operating in the way that they are. And through these institutions, now we can basically get some of the same, we can implement some of the same ideas in a different way. So we don't need the ownership of production by the government to necessarily call it socialism. We can apply socialism, the concept, the core concept, in a different way. So I want you to think of it like this. There's been all this conversation about book bans, right? And I know it may not be popular to quote Rage Against the Machine, but once upon a time, in one of their songs, their lead singer Zach De La Rocha, he said in one of his songs, he said they don't got to burn the books, they just remove them. Now think about the conversation that we're having today, right? Like we're not, they're banning books and people are freaking out. And there's a different conversation to be had there. But just think about that for a second. If we start removing plenty of books and just say, well, you can't have access to them, right? Or there's a very limited access to them, then you don't actually have to go to the point of burning them. Because as long as people don't have them, same thing. It's the same concept. And that's what he's getting at here. He's saying, like, look, you have different ways to implement these ideas that aren't working. And so therefore, the traditional definition of socialism is insufficient to describe the failures that are occurring today, which are following the idea, the core idea of socialism.
This is how we have reached the point where, with different names or forms, good parts of the politically accepted offers in most Western countries are generally collectivist variants. Whether they openly declare themselves as communists, fascists, Nazis, socialists, social democrats, national socialists, Christian Democrats, Keynesians, neo Keynesians, progressives, populists, nationalists, or globalists. In the end, there are no substantive differences. Everyone argues that the state should control all aspects of individuals' lives. All define a model contrary to the one that led humanity to the most spectacular progress in its history. We are here today to extend an invitation to the other Western countries to resume the path towards prosperity. Economic freedom, limited government, and unrestricted respect for private property are vital for economic growth.
So let me just talk about what he said here a moment ago, where he said, look, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. You're barreling down the same path and you're doing the same things. Put it in this context. Have you ever heard the term stock replenishing engineer? I mean, we might have said it as a joke, back in the day, but that just refers to somebody that we might have once called a stock boy, right? Stock replenishing engineer. We've changed things to make them sound different, to make them sound better, right? And so people change some of the terms when they don't, when a term has become negative, then we switch gears and we change it, right? And so we've got DEI and CRT, affirmative action. So a lot of these terms are basically a repackaging of the same core concept. And that's what he's talking about. He's talking about, like, look, doesn't matter. You can come up with all these cool names. You're still the same.
The impoverishment that collectivism produces is not a fantasy, nor is it fatalism. It is a reality that Argentinians have known very well for at least 100 years. Because we have already experienced it, we have already gone through this. Because, as I said before, since we decided to abandon the model of freedom that had made us rich, we are trapped in a downward spiral where we are getting poorer every day. We have already experienced it ourselves, and we are here to warn you about what can happen if Western countries who became rich with the model of freedom continue on this path of servitude. The Argentine case is the empirical proof that regardless of wealth, natural resources, population capability, education level, or the amount of gold bars in the central bank's coffers, these factors do not guarantee success. If measures are adopted that hinder the free functioning of markets, free competition, free price systems, if trade is hindered, if private property is attacked, the only possible destination is poverty. To summarize, I want to convey a message to all entrepreneurs present and those who are not, but are following us from around the globe, whether they're here or not physically. Don't be intimidated by the political caste or the parasites who live off the state. Don't yield to a political class that only wants to prolong its power and preserve its privileges. You are social benefactors. You are heroes. You are the creators of the most extraordinary era of prosperity we have ever experienced. Don't let anyone say ambition is immoral. If you earn money, it's because you provide a superior product, better price, contributing to well-being. Do not yield to the advance of the state. The state is not the solution. The state is the problem itself. You are the true protagonists of this story, and know that from today, you have Argentina as an unconditional ally. Thank you very much, and long life freedom, damn it.
All right. So that was an amazing speech. And I like what he said at the very end. He's like, look, you are the protagonist and don't be intimidated. If you're becoming wealthy, it's because you're delivering a better product. Think about it in terms of just this podcast, right? If I get a lot of subscribers, then it's because I'm doing something right. Right. And it's probably more than one thing, right? There's multiple things that are involved in a podcast. Same thing with a product, any service. There are multiple things that go into that. And every regulation interferes with the voluntary exchange between the idea that you're trying to get out there and other people grabbing, taking full advantage of what it is that you are providing, right? That service or that product, right? Like every regulation interferes with that. And when you have regulation, it interferes in such a way that in two major ways. One, it impedes what the transaction that you and I may want to make, right? So maybe you don't get what, maybe I have something and you want it, and you want it on a particular set of terms, but a regulation is saying, nope, those terms are not acceptable. Minimum wage would be one of them, right? Let's say I hired somebody to do some work on my podcast, and I said, all right, I don't have a whole lot of money, but I can hire you for, $4 an hour, and I'm going to give you 10 hours a week or something like that. And somebody might say, well, no, that's not enough. You can't do that. Regulation is interfering with that exchange. And what that does is it interferes in the exchange between the two people. So now the two people who have decided that their time is they would rather have the $4 an hour than their hour, and I would rather have their hour of time than my $4 that I'm paying them. That interferes in that way, but then it also interferes with me being able to deliver overall a better product for hopefully the betterment of everyone else. Now, by the way, I'm not hiring anybody for $4 an hour, just an example. But the point being, this is what regulation does. It interferes in all directions, and it masks the truth about what people really want, what makes people feel that uh, they have a better life. I would say maybe not better life, but they are better off with something than without something. All right. Before we close out here, let's look at some comments. I see that there's a good handful of comments. I don't know that I can go through all of them, but I did see one that was kind of funny, and I wanted to bring it up on the screen. Dang, where are you at that you are doing live streams so early, dude? Saturday morning here. Um, well, I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and it is crazy early. And the reason I do them at 7 a.m. in the morning is because I have to go to work. In fact, I'm actually a few minutes late. I do work from home. I have a little bit of flexibility here. So that's the reason why I do them so early. And there were so many podcasts that I was seeing in the evening. And then I like to spend some time with my family. So it just wasn't really the best time, so I chose early in the morning because that seems to be just an opportunity that I can do. A lot of challenges with doing that, but that's the way it is. Let's see any other comments here that I want to. Let's see here. Let's see. I'm only skimming through the comments here, everybody. So apologies if I don't get to yours. I'm just kind of taking a look at them, and I appreciate. I think I'm just going to head on out for now because, again, like I said, I am a few minutes late. I do need to get off and get to work because that's the way this free market is working here for me. But I appreciate that everybody has tuned in and listened. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope you found it informative. Hope you found it inspiring, and I want to make sure that you or know to catch me weekdays, 7 a.m., very early for Eastern time for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again, Sunday nights at 7 p.m., where I bring on a co host, Susan Hogarth, and we discuss LP happenings. We look across the vast tyranny that is currently the United States, and we bring news of what's going on in the Libertarian Party and various counties and cities and states across the US. And then hopefully that inspires you to do some of those same things in your community or just get excited about hearing what's going on. Make sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can find those at youtube.libertydad.com. You can also go to rumble.libertydad.com. Subscribe there. If you're watching this at a later point and it's not live, still throw a comment in there. Let me know how I'm doing. I do go back and read the comments. And if you're one of those bots that's going to try to sell me something, you can skip the comment. I don't really need that one. At any rate, last but not least, I want you to remember, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I am out.